Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This right here is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 239, and it is titled 26 Men and a Girl. And it is written by Maxim Gorky. And this is probably written around 1924 to 1927. That's usually what the copyright date on these are. And we left off at the top of page 45 with a new story entitled Her Lover. And we'll start off with it. An acquaintance of mine once told me the following story. When I was a student in Moscow, I happened to live alongside one of those ladies whose repute is questionable. She was a Pole, and they called her Teresa. She was a tallish, powerfully built brunette with black, bushy eyebrows and a large, coarse face, as if carved out by a hatchet. The bestial gleam of her dark eyes, her thick bass voice, her cabman-like gait, and her immense muscular vigor, worthy of a fishwife, inspired me with horror. I lived on the top flight of her garret, and her garret was opposite to mine. I never left my door open when I knew her to be at home. But this, after all, was a very rare occurrence. Sometimes I chanced to meet her on the staircase or in the yard, and she would smile upon me with a smile that seemed to me to be sly and cynical. Occasionally I saw her drunk, with bleary eyes, tousled hair, and a particularly hideous grin. On such occasions she would speak to me. "How do you do, Mr. Student?" And her stupid laugh would still further intensify my loathing of her. I should have liked to have changed my quarters in order to have avoided such encounters and greetings, but my little chamber was a nice one, and there was such a wide view from the window, and it was always so quiet in the street below, so I endured. And one morning I was sprawling on my couch, trying to find some sort of excuse for not attending my class, when the door opened, and the bass voice of Teresa, the loathsome, resounded from my threshold. "Good health to you, Mr. Student." "What do you want?" I said. I saw her face was confused and suppliatory. It was a very unusual sort of face for her. "Sir, I want to beg a favor of you. Will you grant it to me?" I lay there silent and thought to myself, "Gracious! Courage, my boy. I want to send a letter home. That's what it is," she said. Her voice was beseeching, soft, and timid. "Deuce take you," I thought. But up I jumped, sat down at my table, took a sheet of paper, and said, "Come here, sit down and dictate." She came, sat down very gingerly in a chair, and looked at me with a guilty look. "Well, to whom do you want to write?" "To Belislav Kashput, at the town of Schwestwana, in the Warsaw Road." "Well, fire away." "My dear Bowles, my darling, my faithful lover, may the Mother of God protect thee. Thou heart of gold, why hast thou not written for such a long time to thy sorrowing little dove, Teresa?" I very nearly burst out laughing. A sorrowing little dove? More than the Most High, with fists a stone and more in weight, and as black a face as if the little dove had lived all its life in a chimney, and had never once washed itself. Restraining myself somehow, I asked, "Who is this Bowlist?" "Bowles, Mr. Student," she said, as if offended with me for blundering over the name. "He is Bowles, my young man." "Young man? Why are you so surprised, sir? Cannot I, a girl, have a young man?" "She? A girl? Well—" "Oh, my not," I said. "All things are possible. And has he been your young man long?" 6 years. "Oh, Oh, I thought. Well, let us write your letter. And I tell you plainly that I would willingly have changed places with this Bowles if his fair correspondent had not been Teresa, but something less than she. I thank you most heartily, sir, for your kind service, said Teresa to me, with a curtsy. Perhaps I can show you some service, eh? No, I most humbly thank you all the same. Perhaps, sir, your shirts or your trousers may want a little mending. I felt that this mastodon in petticoats had made me grow quite red with shame, and I told her pretty sharply that I had no need whatsoever for her services. She departed. A week or two passed away. It was evening. I was sitting at my window, whistling and thinking of some expedient for enabling me to get away from myself. I was bored. The weather was dirty. I didn't want to go out, and out of sheer inumeri, I had begun a course of self-analysis and reflection. This also was dull enough work, but I didn't care about doing anything else. Then the door opened. Heaven be praised! Someone came in. Oh, Mr. Student, you have no pressing business, I hope? It was Teresa. Ugh. No, what is it? I was going to ask you, sir, to write me another letter. Very well. To Bowles, eh? No, this time it is from him. What? Stupid that I am, it is not for me, Mr. Student. I beg your pardon, it is for a friend of mine. That is to say, not a friend, but an acquaintance. A man acquaintance. He has a sweetheart, just like me here. Teresa. That's how it is. Will you, sir, write a letter to this Teresa? I looked at her. Her face was troubled. Her fingers were trembling. I was a bit fogged at first, and then I guessed how it was. Look here, my lady, I said. There are no Bowles or Teresas at all, and you've been telling me a pack of lies. Don't you come sneaking about me any longer. I have no wish whatsoever to cultivate your acquaintance. Do you understand? And suddenly she grew strangely terrified and distraught. She began to shift from foot to foot without moving from the place, and spluttered comically as if she wanted to say something and couldn't. I waited to see what would come of all this, and I saw and felt that, apparently, I had made a great mistake in suspecting her of wishing to draw me from the path of righteousness. It was evidently something very different. Mr. Student, she began, and suddenly waving her hand, she turned abruptly towards the door and went out. I remained with a very unpleasant feeling in my mind. I listened. Her door was flung violently to. Plainly the poor wench was very angry. I thought it over, and resolved to go to her, and inviting her to come in here, write everything she wanted. I entered her apartment. I looked round. She was sitting at the table, leaning on her elbows with her head in her hands. Listen to me, I said. Now, whenever I come to this point in my story, I always feel horribly awkward and idiotic. Well, listen to me, I said. She leaped from her seat, came towards me with flashing eyes, and laying her hands on my shoulders began to whisper, or rather hum, in her peculiar bass voice. Look you, now. It's like this. There's no Bowles at all, and there's no Teresa either. But what's that to you? Is it a hard thing for you to draw your pen over paper, eh? Also, and you, too, still, such a little fair-haired boy. There's nobody at all, neither. There's nobody at all, neither Bowles nor Teresa, only me. There you have it, and much good may it do you. Pardon me, said I, altogether flabbergasted at such a reception. What is it all about? There's no Bowles, you say? No, so it is. And no Teresa either. And no Teresa. I'm Teresa. I didn't understand it at all. I fixed my eyes upon her and tried to make out which of us was taking leave of his or her senses. But she went again to the table, searched about for something, came back to me, and said in an offended tone, If it was so hard for you to write to Bowles, look, there's your letter, take it. Others will write for me. I looked. In her hand was my letter to Bowles. Whew! Listen, Teresa, what is the meaning of all this? Why must you get others to write for you when I have already written it and you haven't sent it? Sent it where? Why, to this Bowles. There is no such person. I absolutely did not understand it. There was nothing for me but to spit and go. Then she explained. What is it? She said, still offended. There's no such person, I tell you. And she extended her arms as if she herself did not understand why there should be no such person. But I wanted him to be. Am I then not a human creature, like the rest of them? Yes, yes, I know, of course. Yet no harm was done to anyone by my writing to him, that I can see. Pardon me, to whom? To Bowles, of course. But he doesn't exist. Alas, alas. But what if he doesn't? He doesn't exist, but he might. I write to him, and it looks as if he did exist. And Teresa, that's me. And he replied to me, and then I write to him again. I understood at last. And I felt so sick, so miserable, so ashamed. Somehow, alongside of me, not 3 yards away, lived a human creature who had nobody in the world to treat her kindly, affectionately, and this human being had invented a friend for herself. Look now, you wrote me a letter to Bowles, and I gave it to someone else to read it to me, and when they read it to me, I listened and fancied about that Bowles was there, and I asked you to write me a letter from Bowles to Teresa, that is to me. When they write such a letter for me, and read it to me, I feel quite sure that Bowles is there, and life grows easier for me in consequence. Deuce take you for a blockhead, said I to myself when I heard this. And from thenceforth, regularly twice a week, I wrote a letter to Bowles, and an answer from Bowles to Teresa. I write those answers well. She, of course, listened to them, and wept like anything, roared, I should say, with her bass voice, and in return for my thus moving her to tears by real letters from the imaginary Bowles, she began to mend the holes I had in my socks, shirts, and other articles of clothing. Subsequently, about 3 months after this history began, they put her in prison for something or other. No doubt by this time she is dead. My acquaintance shook the ash from his cigarette, looked pensively up at the sky, and thus concluded. Well, the more a human creature has tasted of bitter things, the more it hungers after the sweet things of life. And we, wrapped round in the rags of our virtues, and regarding others through the mist of our self-sufficiency, and persuaded of our universal impeccability, do not understand this. And the whole thing turns out pretty stupidly and very cruelly. The fallen classes, we say. And who are the fallen classes? I should like to know. They are, first of all, people with the same bones, flesh, and blood, and nerves as ourselves. We have been told this day after day for ages, and we actually listen, and the devil only knows how hideous the whole thing is. Or are we completely depraved by the loud sermonizing of humanism? In reality, we also are fallen folks, and so far as I can see, very deeply fallen into the abyss of self-sufficiency and the conviction of our own superiority. But enough of this. It is all as old as the hills, so old that it is a shame to speak of it. Very old indeed. Yes, that's what it is. That's the end of that story. Next story. One autumn night. Once in the autumn, I happened to be in a very unpleasant and inconvenient position. In the town where I had just arrived, and where I knew not a soul, I found myself without a farthing in my pocket, and without a night's lodging. Having sold during the first few days every part of my costume without which it was still possible to go about, I passed from the town into the quarter called Yesti, where were the steamship wharves, a quarter which during the navigation season fermented with boisterous, laborious life, but now was silent and deserted, for we were in the last days of October. Dragging my feet along the moist sand and obstinately scrutinizing it with the desire to discover in it any sort of fragment of food, I wandered alone among the deserted buildings and warehouses, and thought how good it would be to get a full meal. In our present state of culture, hunger of the mind is more quickly satisfied than hunger of the body. You wander about the streets, you are surrounded by buildings not bad looking from the outside, and you may safely say it, not so badly furnished inside, and the sight of them may excite within you stimulating ideas about architecture, hygiene, and many other wise and high-flying subjects. You may meet warmly and neatly dressed folks, all very polite, and turning away from you tactfully, not wishing offensively to notice the lamentable fact of your existence. Well, the mind of a hungry man is always better nourished and healthier than the mind of a well-fed man. And there you have a situation from which you may draw a very ingenious conclusion in favor of the ill-fed. The evening was approaching, the rain was falling, and the wind blew violently from the north. It whistled in the empty booths and shops, blew into the plastered window panes of the taverns, and whipped into foam the wavelets of the river which splashed noisily on the sandy shore, casting high their white crests, racing one after another into the dim distance, and leaping impetuously over one another's shoulders. It seemed as if the river felt the proximity of winter, and was running at random away from the fetters of ice which a north wind might well have flung upon her that very night. The sky was heavy and dark, down from it swept incessantly scarcely visible drops of rain, and the melancholy elegy in nature all around me was emphasized by a couple of battering and misshapen willow trees, and a boat, bottom upwards, that was fastened to their roots. The overturned canoe with its battered keel and the miserable old trees rifled by the cold wind. Everything round me was bankrupt, barren, and dead, and the sky flowed with undryable tears. Everything round was waste and gloomy. It seemed as if everything were dead, leaving me alone amongst the living, and for me also a cold death waited. I was then 18 years old. A good time. I walked and walked along the cold wet sand, making my chattering teeth warble in honor of a cold and hunger, when suddenly, as I was carefully searching for something to eat, behind one of those empty crates, I perceived behind it, crouching on the ground, a figure in woman's clothes, dank with the rain, and clinging fast to her stooping shoulders. Standing over her, I watched to see what she was doing. It appeared that she was digging a trench in the sand with her hands, digging away under one of the crates. "Why are you doing that?" I asked, crouching down on my heels quite close to her. She gave a little scream and was quickly on her legs again. Now that she stood there staring at me, with her wide open gray eyes full of terror, I perceived that it was a girl of my own age, with a very pleasant face, embellished unfortunately by 3 large blue marks. This spotlit her, although those blue marks had been disturbed with a remarkable sense of proportion. One at a time, and all were the equal size, 2 under the eyes, and 1 a little bigger on the forehead, just above the bridge of the nose. This symmetry was evidently the work of an artist, well inured in the business of spoiling the human physiology. The girl looked at me, and the terror in her eyes gradually died out. She shook the sand from her hands, adjusted her cotton headgear, cowered down, and said, "I suppose you too want something to eat. Dig away, then. My hands are tired. Over there." She nodded with her head in the direction of a booth. "There's bread for certain, and sausages too. That booth is still carrying on business." I began to dig. She, after waiting a little, and looking at me, sat down beside me and began to help me. And I think I'll stop there. And that's the end of part 4 of 26 Men and a Girl. And we'll see you again in part 5. Thanks for listening.